and welcome to this tutorial on MPFB skin materials. This is part 3 in the series on MPFB materials. In the video, it is assumed that you have at least skimmed through the 2 earlier parts of the series. You can find links to the other parts in the description of the video. In this video, I will describe the various models available for body skin, as well as provide some detailed demonstrations of features of the material models which are specific for body skin. We will begin with a brief recap of material types to set the scope of the video, and then proceed with a comparison of the types. Then each material model will be described separately. To switch between the material models described in this video, go to the Apply Assets and Library Settings panel. There you will find material settings. The ones we are talking about now are found in the Skin dropdown. Anyway, as a short recap, in Blender, there is a range of possible material setups. On one side of the range, there are material setups which are completely made up of logic, or in practice, combinations of shaded nodes. On the other side of the range, there are image texture-based materials, where aspects are controlled by images rather than by procedural logic. This is not an either-or type of situation though. Usually, materials are combinations of these two strategies. When looking at MPFB material models, we can see that they are on different places in the range between texture-based and procedural. In this video, all materials except the procedural eyes will be touched upon in one way or another. With the exception of procedural eyes, all the material models can be used for body skin. Note this, by the way. I am stressing the body part of body skin. If you have attachable meshes which might constitute parts of a human, then these will never use the skin-specific material models. Say you have attachable fingernails, teeth, ears, or whatever, then these are technically clothes and will thus only be able to use the MakeSkin or game engine material models. In this video, we are only talking about the actual body and the materials which are relevant for that. The material models available for the body are MakeSkin and game engine, enhanced and multilayered. Since MakeSkin and game engine will look exactly the same in almost all cases, I will in the following only say MakeSkin, and you can think and game engine if you want. Since the previous video covered MakeSkin in depth, I will only touch briefly on this material model, focusing on the aspects which are relevant for bodies. After MakeSkin, we will proceed to take a look at the enhanced skin, which adds some procedural bump logic. And finally, we will take a look at the multi-layered model, which is very complex and which will take some time to describe. However, the first question one might ask is, does it matter? Is there a significant difference based on which material model that is chosen? The answer is that it depends. On a close-up render, it would definitely look different. In an animation where the character is seen from afar, it might not be possible to see which material model is used. In the image, you can see the different models rendered on the same character. We will get into details shortly, but if you take a close look, you can see that one of the main differences is the amount of structure in the surface. The image on the left is completely flat, while the image on the right has clearly visible skin structure. Let's take a closer look on each, starting with MakeSkin. This is a zoomed-in render of the upper chest. We can see a solid and smooth surface with a little variation. What color variation we see come from the diffuse texture, in this case the Caucasian young female system skin. Rendering 500 samples of this in HD resolution took 12 seconds. Switching to enhanced, we can see a minor difference in color, which I will explain when getting to that skin model. But the most obvious difference is that we have gotten a noticeable structure on the surface. This is a procedural bump layer, which is intended to be an approximation of skin pores. While we got more detail, we can also notice that the render took almost 5 additional seconds. So the additional detail does not come without a cost. Moving on to the multi-layered model, we get a lot more detail. I won't go into the various aspects until later, but notice you can see hints of subdermal veins as well as dermal surface structure. Here we can see that the detail has a huge impact on render time. Rendering 500 samples took almost half a minute, to be compared with the 12 seconds it took for MakeSkin. But let's dig into the details of the different material models, starting with MakeSkin. If you did not change anything, This is what you will get when assigning a skin for a character. As previously mentioned, MakeSkin is primarily an image texture-based material with some minor tweak controls. As the entire previous video was about MakeSkin, I want to reiterate the basics of this material. MakeSkin for body skin works exactly the same way as MakeSkin for clothes. It is the same material model. This is the base one-size-fits-all material model. If you don't know what to choose, then MakeSkin is a sensible default. It will cause a minimum of confusion. There are also some typical situations where MakeSkin or the game engine variation will fit best. The obvious one would be if you want to export a character to a different application. Then your only sensible choice will be game engine for skin. But say you want to make a large-scale animation with a large number of characters seen from a distance. This would be a typical situation where there is no point in choosing a more complex model. You would want the performance, and the extra detail of the other models would not be possible to see anyway. Now let's create a basic character with the MakeSkin skin. Before applying the skin, we make sure that MakeSkin is selected in the material settings. Then we load one of the basic skins. Quick, easy, and not many places to go wrong. We can now go to the shader panel and play around with some of the available tweaks. The first obvious thing to change would be roughness. This way you can make the character look slightly sweaty. Color mixing works the same as for clothes too. We might want the character to be somewhat more pink. Now, while this was quick and easy, I want to stress that there's no reason to limit yourself to the system skins. These are just minimal starting points. Let's start over and see what happens if we use a more elaborate skin. First, we create a basic character and apply a system skin so we can see the difference. Works, but a bit boring. Now let's switch to a skin from one of the asset packs. I'll use Mindfront's excellent African male skin as an example. Quite a difference, I'd say. As said, MakeSkin for body skin works exactly the same as for clothes. This means you have a full set of image textures supported by MakeSkin to play with. Having a good diffuse texture and a normal map will make a huge difference. If you compare the first and the second image here, you can note especially the clavicle region. As with clothes, achieving the same level of detail using only mesh modeling is very difficult. This will be the case for most finer details. You only get so far with a mesh. To get it to the next level, you will need the help of materials. The next material model we will be looking at is the enhanced model. The fundamental strategy of the model is similar to MakeSkin. You will need image textures. However, on top of this are a number of tweaks to add control and get surface structure. This model also supports material instances, which we will get into shortly. Of the available models, this is the one with the most elaborate UI outside the shader nodes editor. The enhanced model is good if you are in principle satisfied with the fundamental image-based strategy, but want more control and a few more bells and whistles than what you would get with MakeSkin. The downside is that it is unsuitable for export and will not work outside Blender. Now let's take a look at how this material model looks. In the viewport, we have a character which is currently equipped with a MakeSkin material. First, we change the material model to enhanced. Then we apply the new skin. What we can see is that the character basically looks the same, but that we got some surface structure. Note especially how the lips changed. Now, if we go to the materials panel, we can see that we have a control over a few things. What has happened here is that not only one, but 7 material instances have been assigned to the body mesh. Different regions of the body have gotten separate instances of the material. This way, you can have different settings for the surface structure on, for example, the lips, than you would have on the rest of the body. We will get into the various settings that can be controlled shortly. But roughly, they are divided between functionality for controlling the color, functionality for controlling surface structure, and a few aliases for the corresponding sockets of a principal node. Back in the viewport, we can now see what happens when we play around with these controls. Let's start with the principal socket aliases. These are roughness, clear coat, and clear coat roughness. I will leave subsurface scattering outside the discussion for now. The main roughness slider works the same as for the MakeSkin material. You can change it to influence the overall roughness of the object. Clear coat is conceptually like adding a transparent layer of slime on top of the object. This will have a smooth surface, as if the bumps were filled with the slime. When we drag the clear coat roughness slider, we see we get a smooth light reflection, instead of the bumped one we get when dragging the main roughness slider. Moving on to color correction, we have basically the same color mixer as in MakeSkin. If we want to make the skin redder, we can use a red color and then decide how much red to mix in. The two other color corrections are brightness and contrast. This will directly influence the look of the diffuse texture, as you might assume if familiar with what brightness and contrast do in an image editor. These are rather sensitive, so you will want to use small increments. Then we come to the main difference to MakeSkin, the surface texture. What we have here is a procedural texture where inverted bumps have been added. The 4 sliders here influence details of that texture. The most important one is scale. The higher the scale, the smaller the bumps. You will likely want to change this depending on the size of your character. Basically, if you want a coarse structure, you would have a smaller value for scale, whereas a higher value will be seen as more smooth. Detail and distortion influences the shape of the bumps. There's no right or wrong here. Just play around with these settings until you find something you find appealing. Finally, the strength influences the depth of the bumps, where a strength of 0 would cause the surface to be smooth. Now let's take a look at the material instances. Say we want a deeper red on the lips. Then we can control that mix separately. Same with the properties of the procedural bump. In summary, the enhanced skin is an easy way to get more control and a bit more depth than you would get with MakeSkin, while still not being overly complicated. And again, it will make a huge difference if you select a good skin material from an asset pack. Next, we will dig into multi-layered skin model. This is a mostly procedural material, but which will benefit from having a diffuse texture and a normal map. Contrary to enhanced, it does not need material instances to control different parts of the body. Adapting to different body regions is built into the material model. We will take a closer look at the model in a bit. It might look intimidating at first sight, since there's a lot to play around with. Once the basic principle is understood, it should not be rocket science to use though. Due to the level of detail, this is probably not something you will want to use for animation. The main purpose of the material is to render still images. One thing which is very important to understand is that this material model is completely unsuitable for EV. If you try to display this in an EV viewport on a low-end machine, chances are that Blender will freeze or crash. So when intending to play around with this, the very first thing you should do is to make sure that you are in cycles mode. Then let's remove all the material instances we created with the enhanced model. Before adding the actual skin, we make sure that the multi-layered model is selected. Now, This material model is controlled in its entirety from the Shaded Nodes view, so we go to the Shading tab. As said, this might look intimidating, but it is not actually that bad. Before zooming in on the details, let's describe the overall structure. The first node here is the master color control. This is where you set the defaults of all color aspects of the material. This is common for all parts of the body. Then you have a set of control nodes. Each of these control a different part of the body. The first one is for controlling the default of the entire body. Then you have the face and the ears. Then you have lips and fingernails and so on and so forth. So what you would do is pick the control node for the part of the body you want to influence and play with that. The body, face and ears nodes look exactly the same but have different defaults for values. But let's start at the beginning. First we can see we have a diffuse texture node. As said, the multi-layered model is able to stand on its own, although it looks better with a diffuse texture. Let's take a moment to discuss this. This is the diffuse texture as it would look without any procedural logic. Notice that there is some color variation and spots and so on. Note especially the spot slightly above the center of the image. When loading the multi-layered model, we instead get this. Notice that we can still see the spot in the center. Now, let's take a look at what happens when we load the multi-layered model without any diffuse texture at all. The skin looks a bit less detailed and the spot disappeared. But we still have something that looks like a skin and there is plenty of color variation. This separates the multi-layered model from enhanced and MakeSkin. If you remove the diffuse texture from the other models, the skin would be a solid flat color. Back in the Shaded Nodes editor, let's play with some of the color mix settings. The first control is how much influence we want to have from the diffuse texture. Setting this to 0 will cause all colors to be picked from this control node instead. But even if we set it to 1, we have the option to mix in color. An override is to what extent we want to mix in a color. So, same as with the other two models, we can mix in a bit of red if we want to. Same for the lips. I will leave the other color controls for now. Their purpose should become apparent when we discuss the various layers later on. Let's go to the node for the face settings. As said, body and ears work exactly the same. The first setting should cause no surprise. The roughness setting controls the overall roughness of the area. Depending on the bump, this might look a bit different. Again, I will skip the topic of subsurface scattering. This is mainly because explaining the theory of it would take a bit too long for this video. Suffice to say, you can use this to control how soft the skin looks. Then we get to the true procedural layers of the material. Here we have spot, unevenness, dermal, and veins. Starting with spots, this is intended to let you add skin imperfections such as moles. In the default setting, this is hardly visible, so let's exaggerate it a bit. The default color mixer setting is rather subtle. Let's have completely black spots. You could have green ones if you want. Notice you got a black spot on the forehead here. Conceptually, you have a random wave function here, varying over the surface. If a value is below the value cutoff, it won't be seen at all. If it is above the peak, it will be truncated. So I'll lower the value cutoff a bit here. The strength is how much the underlying scale color will be mixed when there's a spot. A value of 1.0 will mean all the color will be taken from the spot. Scale works as we saw in the enhanced skin. A higher value will make things smaller. The detail, distortion, and roughness settings influences the shape of the spots. Generally, low values will cause spots to be round and uniform, while higher values will generate jagged and non-uniform spots. Moving on, I'll just disable the spot layer completely. The next color layer we'll talk about is the color variation. The purpose of this is to avoid having the skin look unnaturally even. Skin is seldomly a flat color without any variation. Thus we add a bit of random brightness noise. Let's exaggerate this a bit. Scale works as with all other procedural layers. The color adjustment here will vary randomly between the normal brightness and the brightness we set here. With a negative brightness, areas will become darker. With a positive brightness, the variation would tend towards lighter. The detail, distortion, and roughness affect the shape of the noise, same as with the spot layer. Play around with these until you get something you like. Now, let's disable this effect too. Next are veins. This effect is very subtle in the default setting. The idea is to simulate veins lying just under the skin. Exaggerating this, we can see random noisy lines. There are actually two layers of veins, one with thick main veins and one with thin auxiliary veins. You can modify the scale of each. The color of the veins are set in the master color control. Before moving on, I'll switch off this too. Next are the layers that contribute to bump. To make it easier to see what happens, I'll disable the diffuse texture so we get a flat color. Then I'll disable the dermal bump so we can talk about the unevenness in oscillation. The purpose of the unevenness is to roughen up the surface so it does not look flat. Exaggerating this and lowering the scale, we can see that it is a Voronoi texture influencing the bump. The detail, distortion, and roughness influences the shape of the noise. Now let's disable this and re-enable the dermal structure. We'll exaggerate this and change the scale. If you look closely at skin, you will see that it looks as if it has flat islands separated by thin valleys. The dermal layer is intended to simulate this. Those were the settings of the skin, and again, the skin of the ears and the body works exactly the same, they just have different defaults and can be controlled separately. Moving on to lips, I'll just hide the face skin so we can see better what happens. Zooming in on the lips, we can see that the edge between the facial skin and the lips is faded. This in contrast to the enhanced skin, where the edge is sharp. As we saw earlier, the lip color can be overridden from the master control. Here, the color is from the diffuse texture. The lips have two separate layers of procedural bump, unevenness and crease. Let's start with unevenness. We first disable the crease so we can see what happens. This is basically the same unevenness as with the main skin. Just something to avoid having the surface appear smooth. Scale, detail, distortion, and roughness works the same as for the other layers. Disabling the unevenness, we can instead move on to crease. The roughness value here is the overall object roughness, by the way. It might be easier to see without the bump. The crease layer is a random noise texture which has been stretched in vertical direction to form creases. We can play around with the stretch to influence how crazy the creases are. Now, we could go on to the other nodes in the model. However, they work mostly the same as the ones we have shown here, and they are also not safe for work. So I will simply point out that they are there to be played with. As we have seen, things will end up looking different depending on what material model you choose to work with. No material model is better than the other. The choice comes down to what use case you have. So before picking a material model, think through what it is you want to achieve. No matter the model, you will have improved results if using a downloadable skin model. In order to figure out what the various knobs and levers do, the best way is to experiment. Regarding experimentation and just for fun, let's create something non-human, just to demonstrate that you're not limited to human shapes or human skins. I'll first model a non-human creature using the animal target assets pack. I'll use one of Minefront's skin as a basis here. The end goal is reptilian, so let's use a bit of green. We can use the spot layer to get some cameo. The dermal layer can be used to get something looking like scales. Now we do the corresponding for the face and the ears. And let's make the lips a bit more coarse. The eyes here are procedural. We'll cover that material in the next video. Just something quick. I'm sure you can do better if you play around with it. Anyway, that's it for today. So thank you for watching and happy modeling.